For more than a century, this part of the Carnegie Mansion was never meant to exist, not lost, not forgotten, designed to be erased. And the moment it resurfaced, the legacy of one of America's most powerful families quietly began to fracture. The discovery beneath the Carnegie Mansion could rewrite the Carnegie legacy, and the first clue is not a hidden room, but the proof that someone went to great lengths to ensure it would never be acknowledged. The mini-verdict is unsettlingly clear. This space was deliberately excluded from every official record, and the evidence lies in a single object recovered at the site, an envelope of waxed fabric bearing an old private archive stamp containing an itemized list written in disciplined office handwriting, yet signed only with an abbreviated mark that does not match any known administrator. What that signature represents, and why it was never meant to be traced, is what this investigation will have to prove. The renovation began as a routine intervention, the kind that modern preservation teams perform dozens of times a year. Structural reinforcement, moisture control, compliance with contemporary safety codes. But when a load-bearing layer was removed in the sub-basement, the work stopped. Behind it was a sealed section absent from every known floor plan. No room number, no administrative notation, no key log, no patrimonial label. In a mansion defined by meticulous documentation, the absence itself was the anomaly. This was not a forgotten storage cavity or a misdrawn blueprint. It was a space engineered to evade memory, and the moment it was breached, the project ceased to be architectural and became juridical and moral. Because in Gilded Age estates, nothing vanished by accident. To understand the weight of that omission, you have to return to the years when the Carnegie name shaped steel, labor, and American ambition itself. Between the 1870s and the early 1900s, industrial fortunes were protected as fiercely as they were built. Ledgers were duplicated, then selectively destroyed. Letters were burned after being summarized. Entire decisions were executed verbally to avoid record. The public saw philanthropy. The archives, when they survived, told a colder story of internal crises, quiet settlements, and reputational triage. Contemporary newspapers occasionally hinted at inconsistencies. Rooms referenced once, then never again. Expenditures logged without destinations. Transfers approved without corresponding. Assets. Clerks who asked questions were reassigned. Witnesses who spoke too freely found their testimony diluted, reframed, or buried under more respectable headlines. What survived was not the truth, but the version safe enough to endure. And yet, beneath this mansion, something endured anyway. Have you ever heard a story like this hidden inside a Gilded Age mansion? If this case reminds you of another sealed room or a forgotten heir, share it in the comments below. This channel exists to reveal what the elite have tried to erase. So like this video, subscribe, and stay with us before this story disappears again. Because when powerful families erase a room from history, they are rarely hiding space. They are hiding consequences. And as we move forward, opening the first layer of this buried record, one question remains suspended in the dark. If this was never meant to be found, what exactly were we never supposed to see? The first mistake people make with a Gilded Age mansion is assuming it was built to be lived in. It was built to be seen. Carnegie Hill was more than an address. It was a stage where reputations were rehearsed in candlelight and polished silver, where a family name could be strengthened with a single dinner and ruined by a single whisper carried out into the street. On the surface, these houses performed stability, music drifting from drawing rooms, fresh flowers arranged with precision, benefactors smiling beneath chandeliers as if wealth itself were a form of public service. But below that performance, another world ran like a hidden bloodstream. Narrow service corridors that avoided grand staircases, locked closets that did not appear on visitor guides, administrative rooms where correspondence was counted, copied, and quietly redirected before it ever touched the wrong hands. That is why the sealed section beneath the Carnegie Mansion does not feel like an architectural oddity. It feels like a function. In these homes, the public and the private were never meant to touch. The public belonged to the family's story, philanthropy, refinement, legacy. The private belonged to the machinery, contracts, disputes, succession, leverage. And yet the inventory list recovered from that waxed envelope suggests a collision so unnatural it almost reads like panic. Personal documents stored alongside office papers, as if someone ran out of time to separate the family from the enterprise. Not a curated archive, a forced cohabitation, the kind that happens when something cannot remain where it belongs and cannot be destroyed without consequence. You can almost picture the logic of it without anyone needing to explain. In the Gilded Age, destruction was not always the cleanest solution. Burning letters created smoke, and smoke created questions. Shredding left scraps. Discarding invited servants, and servants became silent witnesses with memories longer than paychecks. So certain families did what powerful families have always done. When the risk was not exposure, but interpretation, they moved the material into a place where it could be controlled without being handled. A space that could not be requested because it officially did not exist. A room that could not be inventoried because it had never been assigned a number. And the more you understand Carnegie Hill, the more that strategy makes a cold kind of sense. This neighborhood functioned as a network, not just of wealth, but of mutual containment. Families competed in public and cooperated in private, because scandal did not respect property lines. A newspaper headline could cross Fifth Avenue faster than any carriage, and once a narrative took hold, once an insinuation became a fact through repetition, money could not buy it back. So the elite learned to manage the press the way they managed steel and rail, by controlling supply. One carefully placed quote, one friendly editor, one accidental fire in a storage area that conveniently erased a set of correspondence before subpoenas ever arrived. A charitable donation announced at precisely the right moment to drown out an uncomfortable rumor. A dinner invitation extended to the right columnist, so the story on Monday would be about manners, not missing money. That is the world this inventory list belongs to, because the contradiction is not just that the items don't match the public narrative. It's that they appear to belong to different lives, a set of office-style memos stacked beside something intimate, paper that was never intended to pass through clerical hands. The handwriting itself tells you that, disciplined, administrative, the kind used by someone trained to document without emotion. But then the signature is abbreviated, compressed, as if the writer knew that a full name would be too heavy to leave behind. Not anonymity for its own sake, anonymity as a shield, as if even the act of cataloging was dangerous. And once you see it, you start noticing how the house itself is divided into two kinds of truth. The visible truth, preserved for tours and photographs, still frames the Carnegies as the architects of American progress, industry refined into benevolence. The operational truth sits lower, behind locked doors and unmarked cabinets, where reputations were not celebrated but maintained. In that world, legacy was not an abstract word. It was a legal structure. It was inheritance law, trustees, executors, discrete settlements, and the quiet arithmetic of who must never be acknowledged in writing. Which raises a question that doesn't need to be asked out loud to change the temperature in the room. What kind of material gets hidden from the heirs themselves? Because that is what this suggests. Damage control, not privacy. A place where documents could be kept out of circulation even within the family. A sealed pocket of history designed to outlast tempers, lawsuits, divorces, and rival factions inside the same bloodline. A vault not just against the public, but against the next generation. You can hear how easily it would have been framed if it ever surfaced at the wrong time. A misunderstanding, a misfiled record, a private matter. The same language that has softened 100 Golden Age secrets into polite footnotes. But the architecture refuses that comfort. A hidden section without key logs is not a misunderstanding. It is policy. So here's the discrete question I'll leave with you, the one that preservation teams and attorneys never say in the same sentence. Would you have the courage to open an archive that was clearly built not to be opened, knowing that the moment you look, you change its fate? Because to understand what was hidden beneath the Carnegie Mansion, you first have to understand how the elite hid things at all, how they used stone and paper and silence as tools, how erased records became a form of protection, how forbidden rooms could hold more power than public speeches. And as the first pages of that inventory are laid out under modern light, one detail begins to stand apart from the rest. An entry with a name that isn't neatly written at all, but scraped through so hard the paper fibers lift, as if someone tried to remove a person from history without leaving an empty space behind. In houses like this, secrets rarely live in words first. They live in structure. They live in thickness, in weight, in the small architectural choices no guest would ever notice. The kind of choices that only matter to the people who built the house to protect more than comfort. When the crew cleared enough of the sub-basement to expose the sealed section's edges, the room stopped feeling like a space and started reading like a sentence written in brick. The wall was wrong. Not crumbling, not poorly made. Wrong in the way a forged signature is wrong. Competent, deliberate, and slightly out of rhythm with everything around it. The masonry was tighter, the mortar line cleaner in places, inconsistent. In others, as if two different crews had worked with two different instructions, years apart. A preservation specialist ran a flashlight slowly along the joints, the beam catching on a subtle change in the aggregate. One of those details you only learn to see after you've stood inside enough old buildings to recognize when the past has been edited. They found thickness where there shouldn't have been thickness. A wall that functioned less like a boundary and more like a vault. In a Gilded Age mansion that can be explained in a dozen innocent ways. Coal storage, mechanical buffers, fire breaks, security closets for silver and valuables, even the kind of reinforced enclosure wealthy homeowners sometimes demanded after the era's well-publicized burglaries and kidnapping fears began to circulate in the press. The elite loved to pretend their lives were untouchable, but their architects didn't share that fantasy. They built redundancy. They built discrete circulation. They built extra corridors so staff could move without being seen, and extra rooms so certain things could remain close without ever being acknowledged. But this was not that kind of extra. There was a door outline in the wall that did not match any standard service entry. Metal, not wood, with a surface that had aged into a flat, dull patience. No maker's mark, no manufacturer's stamp, nothing you could trace to a catalog or a contract. Just a plate of iron sitting in old stone like it had been installed by someone who understood that names are liabilities. The hinges were the most telling part. Their placement suggested something older, something heavy and original, but the hardware itself looked later. Bolts that didn't belong to the first phase of construction, plates that had been replaced with newer fittings, the kind of update you do when you're not improving function so much as restoring silence. Someone had come back. Not recently, decades ago. Long enough that the replacement work had its own age, its own layer of dust and oxidation. Long enough that the person who authorized it likely died believing they had finished what the original builders started. The seal wasn't simply old, it had been maintained. And maintenance is a form of intention. They worked cautiously, not because anyone expected booby traps or melodrama, but because old houses have their own physics. A pry bar slid under a seam, and the sound that answered back was wrong too. Too clean, too sharp, like metal. Speaking to metal instead of wood giving way. When the edge shifted, it didn't groan. It resisted, then relented in a controlled way, like something designed to open only under insistence. That is when the technical proof began to stack up in a way that would make any historian uneasy. A section of brickwork behind the frame revealed a bond pattern inconsistent with the surrounding foundation, as if the enclosure had been constructed after the main structure was already complete. Not a renovation documented in permits. Not a contractor's edition recorded in the city's tidy bureaucratic handwriting. More like a decision executed privately, within the household's control, financed quietly, supervised by someone trusted enough to know why the work could never appear on paper. In other words, this wasn't just a family secret. It was an administrative irregularity deliberate enough to require coordination, money diverted without explanation, labor hired without the usual trail, materials acquired without receipts that could later be subpoenaed or discovered in estate accounting. In the Gilded Age, the truly powerful didn't hide because they were poor at record-keeping. They hid because they were excellent at it. They knew exactly what paper could do once it left their hands. And it reframes the entire underground world of the mansion. The subsoil wasn't merely functional space, it was a language. Service stairs and coal chutes, storage bays and utility channels, all of it designed so life above could appear effortless. But a sealed section like this suggests a second grammar beneath the first. A way to move objects, documents, perhaps even people, through the house without involving the public rooms at all. A discrete circulation system for Golden Age secrets, the kind of infrastructure you only build when the stakes are higher than embarrassment, when you're protecting inheritance, succession, influence, a dark legacy that could fracture a name. And suddenly, that inventory list found in waxed fabric feels less like a curiosity and more like an index to a larger system. If the space was constructed to disappear, then the contents were likely organized with the same cold discipline, not thrown in, filed, managed, stored like risk. Which is why the first item you want to read isn't the most dramatic. It isn't a love letter. It isn't a confession. It's the thing that always sits at the center of any cover story, the office paper, the memorandum, the ledger entry, the kind of document that can transform rumor into procedure and procedure into legitimacy, even when the act itself was never legitimate. A gloved hand lifted a thin folder from the top of a shallow stack, and the paper made that dry, brittle sound old files make when they've been sleeping too long. On the outer sheet, the ink had faded into the color of old tea. The heading was formal, typed or carefully ruled, except for one detail added later in darker hand, a single surname. Written in the margin, then struck through so violently the page nearly tore. And beneath that, pressed into the paper fibers like a fingerprint, was the faint outline of a seal that didn't belong to any public office at all. The folder with the struck-through surname didn't feel like the beginning of a story. It felt like the middle of one. Like you had walked into a room after the argument ended, while the air still remembered who raised their voice. Beneath it, laid flat as if someone had once wanted it to look respectable, sat a control book that could have belonged to any serious office in New York at the turn of the century. Not ornate, not sentimental, just a hard-backed ledger, the kind used to make decisions look inevitable. Its cover was worn at the corners and oddly clean along the spine, as if it had been handled more often than the surrounding stacks. The first page carried the sober language of administration, the vocabulary that turns private life into inventory. Retained, restricted, do not circulate. Each phrase sat in neat alignment, like a set of rules meant to outlive the people who wrote them. The dates ran through the heart of the Gilded Age, years when wealth was consolidating, when newspapers were becoming engines of public pressure, when families like the Carnegies understood that a reputation could be attacked from a dozen directions at once. Labor unrest, political scrutiny, rival industrialists, scandal dressed up as moral outrage. Technician angled a lamp closer. The light made the ink shine in places where the pen had pressed too hard, where whoever wrote this had paused and returned, reinforcing certain strokes as if clarity itself was a defense. In the margin, a column of observations repeated the same initials, over and over, like a small signature of authority. Not a full name, not a title, just letters, enough for insiders to know who decided, not enough for outsiders to accuse. This is where the logic of these mansions becomes undeniable. An official inventory is designed to distribute a life. It tells heirs what exists, what belongs to the estate, what will be divided, appraised, auctioned, donated, archived. It is the paperwork of continuity. But a secret inventory is built for the opposite purpose. It doesn't exist to pass things on. It exists to pull them out, to remove items from inheritance, from record, from memory. to create a second estate inside the first, one that can't be claimed because it can't be proven. And if you've ever wondered why certain dynasties survive crises that should have ended them, it often comes down to this quiet infrastructure. Private files that never enter probate, agreements that never touch the family's public attorneys, letters that never reach the wrong descendant at the wrong time. Golden Age secrets weren't only kept behind locked doors. They were kept in filing language. A few pages in, the entries started to read like a map of anxiety. Not jewels, not bullion, not art. Those things were too visible, too easily traced, too likely to be photographed for a society column or listed in an insurance schedule. The items recorded here were smaller, stranger, and far more dangerous. Packets of correspondence, envelopes marked as held, receipts attached to unnamed transactions, notes referencing meetings without locations. The ledger treated them all the same, objects to be controlled, because the threat wasn't theft. The threat was circulation. One line, written with particular care, pulled the entire room into a different temperature. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, it was just coldly phrased, letters and receipts, agreement. That word, agreement, didn't belong to family life. It belonged to offices. It belonged to liability. It belonged to the kind of negotiation conducted with closed doors, where a signature could prevent a headline and a payment could prevent a testimony. In the Gilded Age, the press was hungry, but it was also practical. Editors had prices. Columnists had loyalties. A rival could plant a rumor, but a well-timed donation could shift a story. A family could lose control of its narrative in a single day, then buy it back over the course of a week with quiet conversations and charitable gestures. The public believed it was watching history. Behind the scenes, it was watching a transaction. That is why a packet of letters tied to an agreement doesn't suggest a private dispute. It suggests management of damage at a scale where the consequences had to be contained in multiple directions at once. Dynasty, market, politics. In New York, those three were never separate. An industrial family's credibility could move investment confidence, influence regulation, shape philanthropic alliances, and determine who was welcomed into which drawing rooms. A scandal didn't just embarrass, it destabilized. Someone in that mansion understood this well enough to treat reputation like an asset, something that could be protected, leveraged, and, when necessary, bought. The ledger's structure was almost insultingly calm about it. Each entry had a date, a status, and a note. Retained, restricted, do not circulate. Those weren't descriptions, they were instructions, and instructions imply a system of enforcement. People tasked with holding things back, people trained to recognize which papers were never meant to cross a desk, people who knew how to speak to lawyers without writing anything down. You start to imagine the chain of custody without even trying. A clerk in a back office, copying a letter and then burning the draft. A valet carrying a sealed envelope through a service corridor instead of a main hallway. A house administrator signing only with initials because a full name would be too easy to subpoena later. Silent witnesses everywhere, not because they were silent by nature, but because their livelihood depended on remaining invisible. The most unsettling part is that none of it requires imagination. The era taught families to do this. It trained them. The Gilded Age did not invent scandal, but it industrialized it. It turned private life into public currency. And the more powerful you were, the more you learned to build shadow systems beneath the official ones. Erased records that never appear in archives, forbidden rooms that never appear on plans, hidden heirs who never appear in genealogies until someone, a century later, starts asking why. A preservation worker slid a thin bundle from between two ledger pages, as if it had been pressed there intentionally, like a bookmark meant for only one set of hands. The paper was folded with a precise economy, edges aligned, the kind of folding you do when you expect to reopen it, not when you're discarding it. The wax had long since cracked, but the impression remained. Another seal, private again, circular, faintly embossed into the fibers as if the paper had learned to remember pressure. They didn't read it aloud at E. First, the room had a way of discouraging theatrics. The only sounds were gloves brushing paper, a lamp humming softly, the distant thud of modern renovation work continuing elsewhere in the building. Life above proceeding as if the past below wasn't rearranging itself. When the first letter finally opened, it didn't begin with accusation. It didn't begin with threats. It began with something almost careful, almost hesitant. One short line written as if the author knew the words might be used against them later. I was told this would be kept out of the family record. And on the desk beside it, half hidden under the ledger's cover, a brittle document caught the light at the wrong angle, revealing a faint photograph mounted to cardstock, the kind families kept in public albums. Except this one had been altered. A face scrubbed pale, rubbed until only the outline of a head remained, like someone had tried to erase a person without tearing the page. The altered photograph sat there, like an accusation that refused to speak, not torn, not discarded, kept. That detail matters. In a Gilded Age household, you didn't preserve what you meant to forget. You destroyed it cleanly, you replaced it quietly, you pretended it never entered the room, but this had been rubbed down and hidden away, as if the act of erasure itself was the point, proof, for the right eyes, that someone had once been present. The next pages made it worse in a way only administrative language can. No melodrama, no confession, just a pattern. A letterhead from a discreet intermediary, a series of clipped sentences, and a rhythm of numbers that didn't belong to charity or household upkeep. Regular disbursements, predictable intervals, instructions to route payment through approved hands, never directly, never in a name that could surface in a ledger meant for heirs. The kind of system you build when a person must be supported but never recognized. One correspondence, written with a careful neutrality, carried the phrase that shifts the story from architecture to blood, not to be acknowledged publicly. It wasn't framed as shame, it was framed as procedure. The way the Gilded Age converted human complications into manageable categories, something that could be solved with placement, with paperwork, with distance, because families like this didn't only protect money, they protected narrative. They were fluent in social choreography, who entered through the front doors, who used side corridors, who appeared in the opera box, who remained an invisible line item on an accountant's page. At dinners, the table glittered with certainty, names, alliances, reputations sealed with a glance across linen. But behind the scenes, there were always quiet arrangements for what didn't fit. Informal guardianships, private tutors, a change of surname that made a person disappear without needing to exile them entirely, a visit that became a permanent relocation to another city, a sanctioned stay at an institution described publicly as rest, refinement, recovery. Newspapers rarely printed the truth of those arrangements. They printed atmosphere. They printed what families fed them, a travel notice, a vague illness, a relocation for health, a new residence for schooling. The press in that era could be brutal, but it could also be guided, and the elite knew which editors required admiration and which required access. When a narrative risked hardening into scandal, it could be softened into rumor, and rumor could be buried under a flood of more elegant headlines. A philanthropic pledge announced at the right hour, a gala, a remarkable donation to a library or museum, a photograph of a smiling benefactor that gave the public something easier to worship. That is what makes the letters in this sealed section feel like contraband. They weren't sentimental, they were operational. They read like a map of containment, and they were built around a presence the family refused to allow. Into the official story. The most careful detail was how the person was referenced. Sometimes it was a first name only, sometimes a surname that looked like a placeholder, sometimes a single initial. The language never said son or daughter. It never said relative. It never even said ward. It said the matter, the arrangement, the account. as if naming the relationship would create a legal reality the family could no longer control. And then there was the phrase that appears once and changes everything, to be destroyed after review. It was written on a thin sheet attached to a packet of correspondence, almost like a cover note, signed not by a family member, but by an attorney whose name appeared in other contexts with the quiet weight of trust. The kind of lawyer who handled estates, foundations, discrete settlements. A man whose signature on paper meant a problem was being folded into the machinery of legitimacy. There was nothing sensational about it. That was the point. Sensation attracts attention. Procedure attracts silence. Because in the Gilded Age, the most effective cover-ups were never framed as cover-ups. They were framed as management. A private review, a document retained, a file restricted, a paper destroyed as standard practice. And once an action is presented as standard, it becomes almost impossible to challenge without sounding hysterical, which is precisely how powerful families protected themselves. They didn't just erase records, they erased the emotional language that would make an outsider suspect erasure. The consequences of that small note are enormous, even if we refuse to accuse anyone of anything. If there existed someone deliberately removed from public recognition, someone supported through intermediaries, referenced with coded language, and guarded behind instructions of destruction, then this isn't simply a family secret. It is a structural one. It touches inheritance lines and trusteeship decisions. It touches how money moved into foundations and how those foundations were justified. It touches donor intent, which in America becomes legal reality. It touches the mythology the public was asked to believe when it celebrated Andrew Carnegie as a moral architect of modern philanthropy. And you don't have to be cynical to understand why that would matter. The Carnegie legacy was built not only on steel, but on the story told after steel, the transformation of industrial power into cultural authority. Libraries, institutions, the idea that wealth could be redeemed through public good. If a hidden heir existed, or a private dependency, or an internal threat contained through legal language and sealed rooms, it could reframe not just a household narrative, but the moral narrative that the dynasty exported to the nation. The most haunting part is how plausible it all is. Not because every powerful family has a hidden heir, but because every powerful family in that era understood how to make a person socially disappear without killing them. You could remove someone from society with a transfer of address and a new set of stationery. You could bury an identity under a marriage certificate that changed a name, or a relocation that changed acquaintances, or a quiet institutional commitment that never reached public record. Official archives were never designed to capture what wealthy families chose not to declare. They were designed to capture what those families needed the state to recognize. Which brings us back to the sealed section under the mansion. This wasn't built to keep the public out. It was built to keep the state out. And if we're being honest, it was built to keep heirs out too. The kind of internal firewall you install when you know that one day someone inside your own bloodline will ask a question you cannot afford to answer. So let me ask you the discreet question that sits behind every forbidden room and every erased record. If you were handed proof that a name had been deliberately removed, would you speak, or would you stay silent to protect the story? A page near the back of the packet gave a small answer without meaning to. It listed routine expenditures, boarding, clothing, medical supervision, then instructed the intermediary to avoid recurrence in household accountings. There it was again. The fear of circulation, the fear of the wrong clerk seeing the wrong line item, the fear of a ledger meant for probate becoming a ledger that tells the truth. And then, tucked behind that note, the paper trail finally brushed the real world. A slim clipping from a society column, yellowed and folded, mentioning a brief appearance at a charity event, and then, oddly, a sudden absence. No scandal, no explanation. Just a polite gap where a person should have been. A silence made respectable. At the bottom of the clipping, someone had penciled a name, lightly at first, as if testing whether it could exist, then crossed it out so hard the graphite cut into the page. And beside it, under the lamp's modern glare, The rubbed-out photograph seemed to watch without eyes, the blank oval where a face should be holding its position like a wound that never healed. Once you accept that a name was managed like a risk, the rest of the file begins to read with a different kind of clarity. The Gilded Age did not rely on dramatic confessions. It relied on paperwork that looked dull enough to survive. In the drawing rooms above, reputations were performed with linen and laughter. Below, reputations were defended with receipts, intermediaries, and language so neutral it could pass for routine. The packet of accounting slips came next. Thin, brittle sheets, stacked with the careful alignment of someone trained to make disorder look controlled. They were the kind of documents that don't feel important until you realize how hard people work to keep them out of view. Dates, amounts, brief descriptions, services, consultation, transfer, retainer. Words that can mean anything, which is why they're so useful. A gloved finger traced one line, paused, then moved again, as if the eye didn't want to believe how consistent the pattern was. The amounts weren't random. They were paced, regular enough to suggest a commitment, irregular enough to avoid looking like wages. And then, in the margins, the same quiet code repeated. Initials, again. The same hand that annotated "restricted" in the control ledger had passed through this material too. The system wasn't improvisation, it was governance. In New York's elite households, real agreements rarely looked like agreements. Contracts were for outsiders and courts. Within a dynasty, the most effective pact was the one that never had to be presented as one. It was arranged through private offices, trusted attorneys, and people whose entire role in life was to be forgettable. Men who could deliver funds without leaving a name, women who could deliver messages without leaving a witness. The mechanism, was simple. Risk is neutralized not by force, but by absorption. You pay it to go quiet. You relocate it. You rename it. You make sure it never touches a public register where it could become permanent. And the era demanded that kind of vigilance. The late 19th century wasn't only an age of consolidation, it was an age of scrutiny. Labor unrest, strike violence, political backlash, rival industrialists eager to weaponize rumor, a press that could turn a suggestion into a headline by breakfast. A whisper about illegitimacy could unsettle succession. A whisper about coercion could poison philanthropy. A whisper about bribery could rattle bankers who preferred their confidence untested. One loose thread didn't just embarrass a family, it threatened alliances built on the assumption of stability. That's why these receipts matter. Not because money moved, money always moved. Because the way it moved suggests intent to keep it outside the family's official bloodstream. There were payments that looked like charitable disbursements, but were routed through private offices instead of public foundations. There were fees that did not match any known service. There were notations like handled and resolved, words you don't write when you're paying for goods. You write them when you're paying for outcomes. The most chilling entry was almost nothing at all. A vague line item with a date and a number, followed by two words in a smaller, sharper hand. Per arrangement. Not per invoice. Not per delivery. Arrangement, the same cold office word from the letters. The word that belongs to settlement, to containment, to a pact that isn't meant to be romanticized. You could argue, if you wanted comfort, that the family was simply generous, that they supported someone discreetly, that they paid for care, for protection, for privacy. And sometimes that is true. Wealthy families did handle crises privately, and not every hidden file is villainy. But this archive doesn't feel like compassion. It feels like control. The notes are too procedural. The routing is too cautious. The repetition is too practiced. This is not a one-time favor. This is an apparatus. And if an apparatus existed, it would have demanded a second apparatus to keep the public story intact. Because a pact without narrative management is only half a solution. The Gilded Age elite didn't merely remove problems, they replaced them with a cleaner version of events. They understood that the public doesn't need truth, it needs coherence. So you don't just pay. You coordinate, you synchronize, You decide which doors open and which names appear on guest lists. You decide which social appearances are photographed and which are canceled for health. You decide which mentions are encouraged in the papers and which are quietly cut. That is why the file's next layer is almost more unsettling than the money. Evidence of social choreography. A small slip of paper folded twice, with a list of names. Written in an elegant hand, guests likely, followed by a second list in a different hand that looks more like instruction than invitation. Hold. Delay. Do not include. Each phrase clipped, unadorned, as if the writer didn't want to leave their personality on the page. Next to one name was a faint pencil mark that looked like a question at first, then a correction. A line drawn through it, firm and final. These houses functioned like theaters, and theater has stage managers. Someone managed. Who could be seen and when? Someone managed who was not to be recognized. Someone managed the appearance of unity, of lineage, of a family story clean enough to be published in a society column without inviting follow-up. And follow-up was the real danger. Because the press didn't always need proof. It needed contradiction. It needed an inconsistency it could smell. A missing face in a photograph. A recurring payment that didn't fit the household's known expenses. A sudden relocation. A name that appears once, then vanishes. The elite understood this like engineers understand stress fractures. They knew where pressure would show. So they built redundancy. They built silence. They built forbidden rooms. One memo, short, typed on thin stock, looked like it belonged to a private office rather than a home. It referenced exposure in the calm tone of a logistics problem. It mentioned public inconvenience, the way one might mention weather. And then it instructed that future communications be routed through a specific attorney, the same trusted signature that had marked documents to be destroyed after review. The handwriting at the bottom was not emotional. It was resigned, like someone acknowledging the price of protecting a legacy. You don't just pay money, you pay with truth. And somewhere in the middle of those papers, tucked behind receipts and guest notes, there was a small column of clipped press mentions, society blurbs, charity notices, brief lines that felt harmless until you noticed what was missing. Names appear, then vanish, events listed, then edited. One clipping had a clean rectangle cut out of it, as if someone removed a sentence with a blade. Another had ink drawn over a surname so dark it looked bruised. That's the part people forget about Golden Age secrets. They weren't always hidden by locking them away. They were hidden by managing what the public could repeat. Erased records weren't only in archives. They were in newspapers, in social calendars, in the polite void where a person should have been mentioned. The room below the mansion grew quieter as the stack of papers shifted. The lamp hummed. Dust floated slowly through the beam, like ash that never finished falling. A worker lifted one final item from the bottom of the packet, a heavier sheet, stiff with age, something that looked like an official register at first glance, until the details broke that illusion. At the top was a heading that suggested legitimacy. Under Esau, a list of names in tidy rows. And beside one entry, precisely where a family line should have been confirmed, someone had drawn a single, ruthless stroke through the name, then written over it in smaller script, removed. And just beyond that line, at the edge of the page, the blueprint fragment they'd found earlier caught the light again, showing a door outline that still did not appear on any original plan, sitting there in ink like a secret that never learned how to die. By the time you reached the social papers, you realized the archive wasn't only keeping secrets, it was running a system. The Gilded Age didn't depend on one dramatic cover-up. It depended on repetition, small, disciplined choices made in private until they became a reality the public could no longer question. The most powerful families didn't simply survive scandal. They learned to prevent it from forming a shape. A mansion like this wasn't just a home with rooms for guests. It was an administrative node. Somewhere above the gilded staircases and polite laughter, there would have been a correspondence room that smelled faintly of ink and sealing wax, a cabinet where invitations were stacked like ammunition, a secretary's desk where social life was scheduled with the same seriousness as business. Messengers came and went through service doors, carrying envelopes that looked harmless until you understood what they could contain. A warning to an editor, a request to soften a line, a reminder of a donation that had not yet been publicly acknowledged. The papers recovered from the sealed section feel like fragments of that machine. So ordinary at first glance, you almost miss how cold they are. Lists of guests, notes about who was unavailable, a reminder to send flowers, a clipped announcement about a charitable pledge, the kind of material historians would call ephemera, as if it were too light to matter. But here, the ephemera is what controls the air, because reputational cleaning in that era rarely looked like censorship. It looked like etiquette. You didn't silence a person by threatening them in writing. You silenced them by removing the conditions in which their name could circulate. You stopped inviting them. You ensured they never appeared in the same room as someone who might ask questions. You replaced their presence with a socially acceptable explanation: illness, travel, rest, a change of residence for schooling. You offered the press something softer to print. A donation, a dinner, a philanthropic story that made the public feel close to the family without ever letting them close to the truth. That's why the most revealing document in the stack isn't a confession. It's a list. It was written on thicker stock, meant to be handled, revised, reused, like a tool. Names in rows, each marked with a short annotation that made the room go quieter once someone recognized the pattern. Safe. Hostile. Do not inform. The handwriting wasn't emotional. It was managerial. Someone had built a taxonomy of risk. Not just who was welcome, but who was dangerous. Not just who could attend, but who could be trusted with information. In a society governed by access, that kind of list isn't rude. It's power. The initials appeared again in the margins, the same coded authority moving from ledgers to payments to social instructions, as if one hand had been tasked with holding the whole structure together. A few names had faint pencil lines beside them, half erased, revised, like a person's status could change overnight depending on what they knew, what they suspected, what they had been heard saying in the wrong parlor. One entry had a single word underlined twice: hostile. Next to it, the instruction was blunt: no mention. Not no invitation, no mention. As if the danger wasn't the person's presence, but the idea of them. This is the discreet machinery the public never sees. If you can control what circulates among the elite, who speaks to whom, who sits near whom, who is informed, who is left out, you can control what becomes rumor, and if you can control rumor, you can control what the public believes it has heard. The late 19th century loved to imagine itself modern, rational, documented, but it was still an age where belief was manufactured in drawing rooms before it ever reached newsprint. A small packet of correspondence supported it, short letters addressed to editors and columnists, written in a tone that pretended to be casual, the way a request becomes harder to refuse when it arrives wrapped as politeness. There were references to misstatements that needed correction, to unfortunate speculation that should not be given oxygen. A mention of a forthcoming donation placed carefully like bait. And beneath one letter, a handwritten note that sounded almost gentle, except for what it implied. Better to omit than to explain. You don't need to see threats to recognize control. The control is in the choreography. The press in that era might have been hungry, but it was not independent in the way people like to imagine. Newspapers were businesses, and businesses negotiated. Editors depended on access, on advertising, on favors, on the prestige of being invited into the very world they reported on. A family's charitable gifts didn't only build libraries, they built leverage. They created a moral shield so that when inconvenient facts surfaced, the public would hesitate. Surely not them. Surely not the people who gave so much. That moral shield is part of the dark legacy of the era, the ability to convert wealth into credibility, then use credibility to bury the cost of wealth. The list of names suggests something else too: fear, but targeted fear. Not fear of gossip in general. Fear of specific individuals, specific institutions, specific consequences. One line item included a title rather than a name: clerk, surrogate seat, with the note, "Do not inform." Another referenced precinct, contact, followed by a terse mark that looked like an instruction to keep distance. It was the first time the file brushed the edge of government without stepping fully into it, and the effect was immediate. Because once courts and police exist in the margins of your social planning, you're no longer managing etiquette, you're managing exposure. That's the pivot the archive keeps leading us toward. If there are lists, there were events. If there were events, there were dates. And dates allow cross-referencing against newspapers, against city records, against court calendars, against the kind of paper that doesn't care about lineage or philanthropy, the kind of paper that pins a story to a specific day. A final sheet in the stack looked like a social schedule at first, a neat column of dates and occasions, written in the language of invitations, but the notes in the margins pulled it into another category: names paired with safe or hostile, times adjusted, appearances canceled, substitutions made. And next to one date, written smaller, almost like a whisper that didn't want to become ink, was a reference to a second file, something not kept in the household social cabinet at all. Police matter, hold correspondence. The lamp's light fell across the page, and in that glow you could see the faint indentation of a torn staple, as if another document had once been attached and then removed in a hurry. The page ended, but the pressure mark remained, proof that something heavier had been there, something with official weight. And on the line above, where a name should have stood cleanly, the ink was scratched out so aggressively it looked less like editing and more like punishment. The pressure mark where the staple had been told its own story. Something had once been attached. Something someone decided could not remain paired with dates and guest names. The kind of thing you separate on purpose, because once two papers sit together, they begin to corroborate each other. That is how archives become dangerous. Not with a single dramatic page, but with proximity. The document that emerged next was short enough to be missed. No letterhead, no seal, no official stamp that would make a historian relax into categorizing it. It was the opposite of official, and that was precisely what made it feel like interference. The paper was thinner than the correspondence stock, folded tightly, reopened and refolded with the same creases, like a message passed through. More than one set of careful hands. The ink was steady. The language was steadier, quiet, practical, written the way people write when they believe they are solving a problem rather than creating one. It called itself an understanding, not an agreement, not a contract, not a settlement, an understanding, one of those Gilded Age terms that suggests cooperation without admitting obligation. The sentences were short, almost polite, as if the author knew that length invites scrutiny. But in the margins, there were details that didn't belong to family business. Initials that matched none of the household's known clerks, an address written in a blocky hand that looked more municipal than domestic, and a reference to a meeting location that sounded like an office rather than a parlor. Nothing screamed government, nothing needed to. In the Gilded Age, the most effective influence never arrived in uniform. The phrase "resolve discreetly" appeared once, placed like a soft command. The words carried the faint scent of authority. Authority that doesn't need to introduce itself. And then, tucked toward the bottom, almost like an afterthought, was the line that makes paper stop being historical texture and start being institutional risk. Avoid public record. Not avoid publicity. Public record. The circuit of official life. The channels where events become permanent. Court filings, police logs, municipal correspondence. The kind of documentation that outlives families because it belongs to the state. The note wasn't asking for silence in society columns. It was asking for absence in government memory. You don't need to prove a crime to recognize intention. That's the sober truth people forget when they romanticize the era. Interference can be polite. It can be written with clean handwriting. It can arrive as an understanding passed through intermediaries. The question isn't whether the paper looks criminal. The question is what it was designed to prevent. And this line was designed to prevent something from entering the system. A preservation worker laid the document beside the earlier ledger and the guest schedule, and for a moment, the room looked like the back office of a private empire rather than the basement of a historic home. The same hand that annotated "Do not circulate" had made a small mark beside the "Avoid public record" line, an underline, then a dot, as if confirming that the most important instruction had been received. The lamp's light caught the indentation left by the pen, and you could see how hard the writer pressed on that sentence. Not anger. Emphasis. Priority. This is where the story stops being contained by family walls. Because once you have language about public record, you have the suggestion that someone wanted to keep an event from becoming official fact. That changes the entire frame. The sealed room becomes less like a private vault and more like a junction, where household interests and public processes quietly met. The Gilded Age was full of these junctions, even when they weren't written down. Industrial power needed stability. Banks needed confidence. Political alliances needed donors who looked clean. And clean meant predictable. Clean meant the public story remained intact. A rumor could rattle a market. A scandal could frighten investors. An allegation could sour the very social networks that kept certain men seated at certain tables where policy was discussed as casually as dessert. So the elite built systems to handle problems before they became public, and when those problems threatened to touch the state, they didn't always fight them in court. They prevented them from becoming court matters at all. They negotiated their way around the record. They leaned on relationships that were never described as relationships. They used private offices to neutralize risk the way corporations neutralize liability. Quietly, early, with paperwork that looks boring enough to survive. The short document mentioned addresses in a way that felt like routing. Where to send correspondence, who to contact, which names to avoid. It didn't say police. It didn't say court. It didn't need to. It referenced the clerk, the file, the matter, and then used a phrase that landed like cold metal: no entry. It was written as if the author believed that the state's memory could be guided, that a fact could be prevented from becoming a fact simply by controlling the doorway it would have to pass through. If you're wondering why this matters beyond gossip, here is the adult answer. Public institutions only function when public records are honest. If private interests learned how to pressure what entered those records, then the archive beneath the mansion is not just a collection of Golden Age secrets. It is a clue to a mechanism that might have supported public decisions with hidden costs, a mechanism that might have protected a dynasty by bending the border between private influence and public process. And that's when the Carnegie legacy begins to look less like marble and more like paper that can be filed, altered, delayed, withheld. Because once the state is touched, the story doesn't end with the family. It spreads outward, into foundations, into philanthropy, into the press that printed the public statue while the private file was being sealed underground. It raises questions about what was kept off the books and what else was built on the assumption that the public would never see the seams. So, let me ask you the question that this document forces, the one that lingers after the lamp is turned off. What would you do if you found a page that suggests the truth was buried, not by time, but by power? The crew didn't answer. They didn't need to. They moved to the next sheet, and the air shifted again. A faintly official-looking note, still without letterhead, listed 2 dates, a location, and a set of initials that did not appear anywhere else in the family material. Beside the second date, in the same small handwriting that underlined "Avoid public record," someone had written a single instruction: remove mention. And just below it, half obscured by the fold, there was a name written once. Clean, legible, then scratched out until the ink tore the fibers, leaving only the ghost of letters behind. The scratched out name should have ended the line, but it didn't. It left behind a residue, letters you could almost reconstruct if you stared long enough, like a face you can't quite recall but swear you've seen in an old photograph. That's the strange thing about erasure. It rarely deletes. It only forces the mind to work harder. And in doing so, it makes the missing piece feel more real than what remains. When the team began laying the papers side by side, guest schedules, understandings, restricted ledgers, routed payments, the archive stopped reading like a scandal and started reading like a structure. Not a single event to be judged, but a system to be understood. And if there is one system the Gilded Age perfected, it was this: how to let the public see only what it can digest. That is where philanthropy enters the room, not as a villain and not as a halo, but as a mechanism with two faces. In the late 19th century, giving could be real virtue. It could also be strategy. A donation could be an act of conviction and still function as a shield. These things don't cancel each other out. They coexist, and that coexistence is what makes the Carnegie legacy so powerful and suddenly so fragile. Because large gifts don't erase facts. They reorganize memory. A thin set of clippings and typed summaries appeared in the file, each one describing public gestures in the clean language of announcements, pledges, endowments, funding commitments, public ceremonies. The tone was celebratory, the kind of wording you'd expect from a press office before press offices had names. Some of the papers looked copied from newspapers. Some looked like internal summaries meant for private circulation, brief, tidy, designed to be repeated. A worker held one sheet closer to the lamp, and the light revealed a faint grid beneath the ink, as if the page had been drafted on a clerk's pad, not torn from a paper. A few lines had been underlined in pencil by someone who wasn't reading for inspiration, but for timing. Then the dates began to align. Not perfectly. Nothing in this world ever aligns perfectly, but often enough to feel intentional. On one side of the table, a restricted ledger recorded crisis language in its own careful dialect: retained, handled, do not circulate. On the other, public donation notices bloomed, bold, moral, uncomplicated. A pledge that drew society praise, a benefaction that inspired editorials about duty, a well-publicized gift that made the family's name easier to admire than to question. The pattern wasn't proof of cynicism. It was proof of awareness. In a Gilded Age mansion, awareness was everything. If a rumor threatened the family's internal stability, inheritance anxieties, a name that wouldn't stay erased, an agreement that required continued payment, then the public story needed to be fortified. Not with lies necessarily, but with weight. A large philanthropic gesture adds weight. It creates a narrative the public prefers to hold. It gives editors a headline they can print without inviting subpoenas or retaliation. It gives society something clean to talk about in drawing rooms. And it gives the family the most valuable resource of all: moral leverage. You can watch the logic moving through the papers like a quiet current. One page listed talkers, hostile, do not inform. Another listed a charity event where a key editor was present. Another noted a donation announcement to be placed at a specific time, like a curtain dropping on an inconvenient scene. None of it screamed manipulation. That's why it works. The most effective narrative control never looks like control. It looks like leadership. It looks like generosity. It looks like the kind of public virtue that makes private questions feel impolite. And that is what complicates the story in the mature way it deserves to be complicated. If the archive confirms this pattern, it doesn't destroy the historical significance of philanthropy. It deepens it. It forces us to admit that in this era, public good and public management could share the same doorway. A family could build libraries and still build forbidden rooms. A man could sincerely believe in education and still fear what one letter might do to his household structure. The Gilded Age was not a simple morality play. It was a machine that produced greatness and damage at the same time, and then taught itself how to be admired for one while burying the other. The most telling sheet wasn't even a donation notice. It was a private calendar page, thin, nearly translucent, with small handwriting, filling its margins. It listed social obligations, meetings, and what looked like a scheduling note, pledge finalized. Next to it, in a different ink, was a phrase that didn't belong to philanthropy at all, quiet period. Then below, another, avoid record. It was the same vocabulary returning again and again, record, circulation, omission, like the entire world of the mansion was built around what could be made official and what had to remain vapor. And once you see that, you begin to understand why this archive feels designed not just to hide a person, but to maintain a myth. Myths aren't created by one speech. They're created by repetition, by rituals, by public gestures, by the steady reinforcement of a story that becomes so familiar, it starts to feel like fact. That's why philanthropy is such a powerful tool in the building of a legacy. It gives the story something to attach to: stone buildings, plaques, dedications, names engraved so deeply they appear permanent. But paper has its own permanence too, especially when it's buried. One clipping in the stack described a public donation with almost devotional language, praise for vision, for civic duty, for the moral responsibility of wealth. In the margin, someone had drawn a small mark beside the date, and when you traced that date back to the private ledger, it sat uncomfortably close to a line item labeled only agreement renewed. The two worlds didn't touch in public. Here they touched on the table. This is how the archive begins to rewrite a legacy, not by shouting fraud, not by making the past cartoonish, but by revealing the layered mechanics behind the statue. The Carnegie legacy starts to look less like a single monument and more like a system of competing necessities: idealism and fear, public generosity and private containment, virtue and the constant vigilance required to keep a dynasty coherent. And that system did not end with the Gilded Age. If anything, it matured. As America turned toward the early 20th century, as the country moved toward its own modern golden age of mass media and manufactured narratives, the tools became more sophisticated. The elite learned that controlling records was only one part of the equation. The other part was controlling the story people wanted to repeat. Because if you can't erase the truth completely, you can sometimes drown it. A worker lifted the last item from the pile, a small, stiff card that looked like it belonged in a public album, the kind kept for guests to admire. The front carried a formal dedication line, the type of phrase meant to endure in marble. But when it was turned over, the back held something different, a list of talking points in neat script, as if someone had planned how the donation would be described, which words should appear in print, which names should be included, which names should never be spoken. And at the bottom, written smaller than everything else, almost pressed into the paper like a whisper: if questioned, refer to the narrative. The lamp hummed, the dust drifted, and on the table beside that card, the rubbed-out photograph lay face down for a moment, until a draft from the stairwell lifted its corner, revealing the blank oval again, a missing face staring up like an absence that had learned how to survive. Refer to the narrative is the kind of instruction that doesn't belong in a home unless the home has become something else entirely. A residence can hide things. A dynasty can hide people. But a narrative is different. A narrative is meant to travel. It's meant to be repeated in parlors, printed in papers, engraved in memory until it replaces whatever actually happened. And once you see that phrase on the back of a donation card, you stop thinking in terms of secrets and start thinking in terms of authorship. This is where the end of the Gilded Age begins to blur into the emerging modern era. Not because the elite suddenly became theatrical, but because the cultural machinery around them evolved. By the early 20th century, America was learning new ways to package reality. Syndicated columns, polished biographies, carefully edited memoirs, authorized accounts that looked independent but moved with the quiet obedience of money. The instinct remained the same as it had been in the 1880s: protect the name. The methods simply became more refined, more portable, easier to distribute. The archive beneath the mansion holds proof of that evolution in the least romantic form possible: drafts. Thin sheets, some typed, some handwritten, some crossed out and rewritten, the way you rewrite something you plan to say publicly until it sounds natural. The language wasn't legal. It wasn't accounting. It was explanation. It was the voice of a family rehearsing itself. A worker lifted one page and the paper made that dry, papery sigh as it unfolded, revealing a paragraph with 3 versions of the same sentence. Each one softer than the last, each one, designed to close a door without appearing to close it. One line appeared again and again with slight variations, like a practiced answer to a question no one was supposed to ask. He is not in the city at present. Then, in pencil beside it, a note. Too specific. Another version, an absence due to health. Pencil note, better. Another, traveling for rest, no mention. That phrase, no mention, kept returning like a quiet refrain, the same cold instruction that haunted the ledgers and the lists. What was being managed here wasn't only information, it was the audience's imagination. Because if you can't stop people from noticing an absence, you can control how they interpret it. The drafts weren't limited to one person either. They included phrases clearly designed for different contexts, society columns, charitable announcements, private remarks to be delivered in a drawing room with a smile. Some read like the early bones of an official biography, polished sentences praising principle and duty, while carefully stepping around the messy edges of real life. One page had a header that suggested it belonged to a consultant or a private secretary rather than a family member. The wording had that faintly manufactured smoothness, sentences that don't rise from human speech, but from rehearsal. And in the margins you could see the work, strike-throughs, substitutions, small notes like remove emotion, avoid speculation, refer to giving. Gilded Age secrets weren't always hidden by lock and key. Sometimes they were hidden by flooding the public space with a cleaner, brighter story. If the family could be seen as benefactors, then the public would instinctively resist believing the darker version. That's the cultural math philanthropy makes possible. It buys not silence, but disbelief. A small stack of index cards made the point even sharper. They were the size of prompts, prepared phrases meant to be repeated until they sounded spontaneous. We are grateful for the concern. The matter has been addressed privately. No further comment is appropriate. Each line felt like it had been tested, not in court, but in conversation, at dinners, at charity events, in the brief moments when a question might slip past etiquette and land on something raw. And then you realize something else. This is not only about controlling what the public believes, it's about controlling what the future remembers. Because once a version of events enters print, once a biography hardens into the story, once a society columnist repeats an explanation that sounds plausible enough, archives become less important. Public memory does the work for you. The family no longer needs to defend every detail. It simply needs to keep repeating the same shape of truth until alternative shapes feel absurd. That's how collective memory is organized, not by one document, but by 1,000 small reinforcements. The papers under the mansion suggest the Carnegie legacy was not merely lived. It was edited, and edited legacies require editors. A folded memorandum at the bottom of the draft stack carried a list of names, some crossed out, some circled, followed by a short instruction that felt almost modern, approved language only. Next to it, a second line, send to column. There it was again, the quiet alliance with public narration. The mansion wasn't just deciding what to hide, it was deciding what to publish. The most unsettling page of all looked like a half-written preface, the sort of thing you might place at the beginning of a respectable memoir. It spoke in broad, noble terms about progress, industry, service, and the obligations of fortune. But a corner of the page had been folded back, and when it was opened, it revealed a penciled note underneath, something never intended for readers. This must cover the other matter. The other matter. Always the other matter. Always the part that cannot be named without becoming real. And as the lamp's heat warmed the air slightly, The table began to feel less like a discovery site and more like a writer's room for power, where inconvenient facts were turned into acceptable versions, where absences were given rehearsed meanings, where silence was given a script so it could be delivered with confidence. If you're watching closely, you can see the machine shifting from secrecy to storytelling. A forbidden room becomes a private stage. A ledger becomes a plot device. A donation becomes a scene change. And somewhere behind all of it, there is always someone tasked with execution. Someone who turns instructions into outcomes. Because rehearsed language doesn't write itself. Lists don't mark themselves safe and hostile. Payments don't route themselves through intermediaries. A narrative is a product, and products have managers. A final sheet slid free from the stack as if it had been stuck there by static. It was a simple instruction note, typed, signed with initials that had been haunting the margins for hours. Beneath the initials was an amount, another payment, and beside it, a single phrase underlined twice, for preparation. The lamp hummed, dust drifted, and on the corner of the table, the rubbed-out photograph lay face up again, its blank oval catching the light like a wound that had been carefully framed for history to admire. The line, for preparation, sat on the page like a modern phrase wearing an old suit. It wasn't just money for services. It wasn't just payment for silence. It was payment for shaping what would be said, how it would be said, and who would be permitted to say it. And once you understand that, the basement stops feeling like a discovery site and starts feeling like a threshold, where a century of controlled memory is suddenly forced to negotiate with the present. Above ground, the Carnegie Mansion is no longer a private fortress. It belongs to public life now. Heritage, education, curated history, the kind of institutional environment that invites school groups and donors and scholars to walk through rooms that were once reserved for a single class of people. The neighborhood around it has changed, the city has changed, the country has changed. But the instinct embedded in these papers hasn't changed at all. The instinct is simple. Keep the story coherent. Keep the mess contained. Keep the public believing that what it sees is the whole. That is the dilemma the present inherits, and it's not as clean as people want it to be. Because there are two easy mistakes you can make with a buried archive like this. The first is spectacle, turning it into a headline, a thrill, a shallow scandal that feeds on outrage and then moves on, leaving behind only damage. The second is repetition, hiding it all again in the name of protecting the institution, which is just the Gilded Age mechanism in modern language. One mistake cheapens the truth, the other buries it. And in that room, under the humming lamp and the drifting dust, the dilemma felt physical. The renovation sounds upstairs continued like an indifferent heartbeat, tools tapping, distant footsteps, a door opening and closing somewhere above as if nothing had happened. But the people around the table moved differently now. Papers were lifted more carefully. A page was held up to the light before being set down. A glove paused over a margin, hesitant, as if even touch might be a kind of decision. Because when you uncover erased records, you don't just find information, you inherit responsibility. The archive had already crossed so many boundaries, private and public, family and state, philanthropy and narrative, that it could no longer be treated as a curiosity. It had institutional consequences built into its fibers. If a void public record appears on paper, you can't pretend you didn't see it. If a name is struck out until the page tears, you can't call it an accident of paperwork. If a person is not to be acknowledged publicly, while expenses are routed through intermediaries, you can't reduce it to gossip. This is a file that suggests the past wasn't simply lived, it was managed. And then, in the middle of that tension, the archive offered its final kind of cruelty. It anticipated the future. A thin note. No letterhead again, no seal, nothing that would make it official, had been folded into the back of a ledger, almost like an instruction hidden inside a prayer book. The handwriting was smaller than the others, tighter, as If the author expected the paper to be found by the wrong eyes one day and tried to shrink the meaning into invisibility. The sentence was short, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. Remove contents when there is a change of guardians. Not heirs. Guardians. The word didn't belong to family dinners. It belonged to stewardship. It belonged to trustees, administrators, curators, people who hold something for the future. Someone had written this as if the archive itself had a life cycle, as if silence needed a maintenance plan, as if the system of concealment should survive the very people who built it. That one line makes the entire discovery feel less like accident and more like design. The sealed room wasn't only constructed to hide, it was constructed to outlast. It was built with the expectation that there would be a moment when new hands took over, new staff, new trustees, new institutional stewards, and that moment would be the risk. Because new guardians don't share the old loyalties. They don't carry the same fear. They might ask different questions. They might open the wrong cabinet. So the old system tried to protect itself across time. That is what makes this a dark legacy. The attempt to control not only what the public knew in 1900, but what the future would be allowed to know in 2000. It's difficult to explain how chilling that is without resorting to melodrama, but the room didn't need embellishment. A preservation specialist turned the note over, and the reverse side showed the ghost of another message pressed into the paper, indentations from a different page once written on top of it, like a second voice trapped beneath the first. The lamp angled, shadows shifted, and for a moment, the note looked less like an artifact and more like an order, waiting patiently for the right moment. This is where the adult question emerges, not, should we expose it? Exposure is easy. Exposure is loud. Exposure is what the public expects. The harder question is, can you read it responsibly without reenacting the cruelty it contains? Because if there was a hidden heir, or an erased person, or a private settlement designed to prevent public record, there may be descendants now. There may be institutions tied to donor intent, legal frameworks built on the public story, reputations that have become part of civic identity. The Carnegie name doesn't only live in history books, it lives in libraries, in foundations, in the moral architecture of American philanthropy. Pulling a thread like this doesn't only change a family narrative, it touches the way a city remembers itself. At the same time, burying the file again would be its own act of violence, especially if the paper suggests that someone was deliberately removed from memory. Silence is not neutral in a story like this. Silence is a choice. It's the choice the Gilded Age made over and over again, because it was effective, because it was quiet, because it preserved the surface. And yet the present isn't obligated to repeat the past. A small stack of documents had been set aside as most sensitive, not because they were dramatic, but because they were procedural. Avoid public record. Do not inform. To be destroyed after review. These are the phrases that indicate a machinery of control, the kind of machinery that doesn't vanish just because the wallpaper changes. A modern institution, faced with this, has to decide whether it will become the next guardian in that chain, or the first one to break it. The room below the mansion began to feel less like a hidden place, and more like a hearing, silent, informal, but real. Every movement became interpretive. A page placed under a weight looked like evidence being secured. A photograph turned face down looked like an instinct to protect. A phone left untouched on a workbench looked like restraint. And somewhere in that careful choreography, you could sense the old fear still working. The fear that truth, once spoken, can't be returned to its envelope. That's why the courage required here isn't the courage to shock people. It's the courage to treat the past with enough respect to let it be complex, to resist turning it into a single villainous narrative, and also resist turning it into a polished legacy story that swallows inconvenient lives. The Gilded Age loved clean versions. The present has an opportunity to do something rarer, to accept layered reality, because a buried archive doesn't always demand noise. Sometimes it demands reading, it demands method, it demands cross-checking dates against public records, comparing safe and hostile lists against social calendars, matching rooted payments to periods of visible public giving, tracing initials through attorney signatures and intermediary addresses. It demands the slow work the original system tried to prevent, work that turns private control back into public understanding. And that is the strange irony of this room. It was built to disappear. It survived anyway. It crossed a century intact, as if the house itself refused to fully cooperate with the story written for it. Now it sits in the present like an unanswered question, waiting to see what kind of guardians we are. A worker gathered the most fragile pages and slid them into archival sleeves. The plastic caught the lamp's light and reflected it back in sharp edges, turning the papers into something that looked newly manufactured. Modern, protected, official. Another person placed the altered photograph into a folder, the blank oval still visible for a moment before it vanished under the cover. And the last thing left on the table, after the stacks were secured, was that thin instruction note, the one that tried to reach into the future and keep silence alive. Remove contents when there is a change of guardians. The word sat there, calm and confident, as if the past still believed it could give orders. And as the lamp hummed above them, the ink looked almost wet, like it had been written for this moment. The note remained on the table after everything else had been sleeved and secured, its sentence lying flat beneath the lamp as though it had never belonged to paper at all, but to policy. Remove contents when there is a change of guardians. Not a warning, not a request, a design. Quietly confident that time would do what fear once did, and that new hands would eventually obey old instructions simply because the ink had survived. Above, the mansion continued, its modern life without pause. Somewhere beyond the sub-basement walls, doors opened for staff, keys turned in locks that were properly logged, and hallways held the familiar choreography of an institution that believes it knows its own past. Yet below, in the stale air where stone remembers more than people do, the archive had shifted the axis of the building. It had turned a renovation into a question, and a question into a responsibility. This is the burden such discoveries bring. Not the thrill of what was found, but the weight of why it was hidden. The Gilded Age did not bury objects merely to protect valuables. It buried decisions. It buried names. It buried consequences, then built philanthropy, etiquette, and public virtue above the burial site until the surface seemed unquestionable. In these houses, the visible world was never the whole world. It was only the world deemed safe for circulation. And if the official story is a version, then the deeper matter is not what lay behind the sealed masonry, but who benefited from its absence. A private record that instructs future guardians to remove it is not simply a relic of family paranoia. It is a statement of intent that crosses generations. It suggests a confidence that memory could be managed indefinitely, by architecture, by paper, by silence, and by the comforting public spectacle of admirable deeds. The documents we have seen do not demand sensational certainty. They demand careful reading. They ask for dates, to be compared against public announcements, for names marked safe and hostile to be weighed against society calendars, for routed payments to be traced against the moments when charitable gestures conveniently brightened the page. They invite the kind of method the old system feared: slow corroboration, the patient assembling of a picture from fragments that were never meant to sit side by side. Even now, the final pages do not speak loudly. They do not confess. They do not resolve. They simply persist. An altered photograph, a struck-through name, an understanding that avoids public record, and a sentence written to outlast its authors. And in that persistence is the most unsettling implication of all, that this may not be the only chamber built to disappear, nor the only file designed to outlive the people who created it. If you choose to remain with us, so that you are here when the next sealed door finally opens, subscribe, and keep your place in these corridors where history was edited rather than recorded. Leave your thoughts below, Every perspective helps illuminate what the official archive tried to bury and what it still refuses to name. And if this investigation has resonated with you, let us know. So the record of your attention tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth entering again. Because beyond the gilded railings and polished dedications, the American elite learned something early. When truth threatens a legacy, the most effective defense is not always denial, but narrative. And if you are willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Another corridor, another ledger, another silence that was carefully maintained until the right moment broke it open. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.